Hey, hello. My name is Jessica, and this is my presentation about the anthropology of illness. This is for my research project for my anthropology class this semester. So I wanted to just start out with a bit of the motivation behind this project. So specifically, this is definitely a personal motivation because I was getting sick a lot at the beginning of this semester. Things that was probably like a sinus infection, maybe reoccurring, maybe different sinus infections, but a lot of I would get sick, have a bit of a break, get sick again. And I realized during this time that it can actually be very challenging to communicate even very mundane aspects of illness, because there's a lot of times in which I was not necessarily outwardly sick, but I just had a lot of tiredness and low energy-ness, and that was, I found, very difficult to communicate to people in a clear way. So that was my initial motivation for this research, kind of thinking about how we communicate aspect of illness. But one of the first things I did was, in terms of framing this as my research project, I wanted to think about the anthropological relevance and framework behind these concepts, specifically about illness. So one of the things I found was this paper about the anthropological inquiry of disease, illness, and sickness. And this outlines some of previous anthropological thought about the division between these three categories, and also just kind of expounds further on these concepts. So specifically, I wanted to bring up the illness versus disease kind of aspect, and I think this paragraph really well encapsulates that. So I highlighted some relevant sentences. So this says that illness refers to the subjective response of the patient being unwell, and illness is profoundly influenced by the patient's social and cultural background as well as his personal traits. So this is in comparison to the disease model, which is the Western biomedical disease model, in which it is more of a medical notion, versus illness is takes into account the patient's perspective of their health, which is impacted by their social and cultural background. So I found this important for framing the concept of illness within a cultural sphere, because I feel like it really resonates with how the ways we experience something that may be viewed as objective is actually very subjective based on how we are socialized. And this goes back to the notion of communicating illness, because the way we communicate it is also socialized by our culture and can also impact the way we experience our illness, or other people perceive our illness. So I really wanted to bring up the notion of illness to frame it within a cultural context. And another way I want to frame it within this cultural context is by talking about the cultural system of health. So this is from a paper about the introduction to the concept of culture applied to the health sciences. So it goes through different examples of cultures and how they experience concept of health differently. And kind of brings up examples to bring to light the fact that a culture and how you're socialized will impact how you actually perceive your own health. So one of the kind of conclusions to this was this paragraph that I highlighted here, and it says that each and all cultures possess concepts of what it is to be sick or healthy. They also have disease classifications, and these are organized according to criteria of symptoms, severity, etc. Their classification, as well as concepts of health and illness, are not universal and rarely reflect the biomedical definitions. So I think this paper goes further into my area, my kind of motivation about the communication of illness, because it brings up the concept of the classifications of symptoms and concepts of sick and healthy, and definitions, and these like biomedical definitions. So I think by starting to think about how these classifications can be very subjective based on culture, you start to think about how the communication of your illness can be very subjective and profoundly impacted by how you're socialized. So yeah, those were the two main things that I wanted to bring up. So now we can go more into my specific question of how is our communication of illness impacted by social and cultural factors. So this kind of ties together my original motivation as well as the anthropological framework. So we see my original motivation with the concept of communication. And that was something that I really wanted to focus on for my research. And then we see the impact of the first paper by using the phrase illness instead of something else, because illness is what encapsulates the individual's subjective experience of their sickness. And then we kind of have the impact of the second paper of talking about the social cultural factors that go into our experience of illness, and thus our communication of that illness. So this really ties those things together. So specifically in terms of my research, I wanted to focus on the language that we use to communicate common or mundane illnesses. So I wanted to think about why people use certain words or phrases and what language they use in different settings, if there's ever any miscommunications that occur. And then more broadly, I wanted to think about how our language is informed by or informs our culture. So this is something that's a little harder to kind of get direct results from because the concept of culture is very difficult to define. But in general, that was something I was thinking of throughout my research of how this all relates back to the culture that we are in. And again, that extends from the anthropological foundation about understanding illness as a cultural phenomenon. So extending it from just illness as a cultural phenomenon, I wanted to examine how people communicate their illness within a culture, specifically our culture. So specifically at Rice. So yes, that goes into the methods. I interviewed 4 people at Rice. I wanted to interview kind of my peers because I felt like they would be more comfortable using the language that they would typically use. And we would have already a more like baseline to get started off of. So I interviewed 4 people, Kat, Victor, Agatha, and Nikki. And I wanted these interviews to be semi-structured to allow the interviewees to share their experiences in an open environment and kind of bring up their experiences as they thought about it. And then I could structure things to open up more questions and such. So just in introduction to the 4 interviewees, I wanted to kind of talk about their experiences with sickness overall this semester or in their life. And because that is mostly kind of the framework, these sicknesses are the framework under which we started talking about these, about their communication. So Kat has gotten sick multiple times this semester. She's had 3 fevers and also has gone on like antibiotics once or twice. And Victor has had pretty bad seasonal allergies for most of his life, but especially for this semester. And he also thinks that these have been mixed with certain illnesses, so such that there are kind of multiple continuous weeks in which he felt pretty bad on a range from just generally congested and then all the way to like very sick. Agatha got pretty sick during a trip with friends, and then was sick for about 2 weeks after that. Then a week after the time she'd recovered from that initial sickness, she got sick again. Pretty unfortunate. And Nikki had to have her tonsils removed in middle school due to chronic tonsillitis. And during the time she had chronic tonsillitis, she'd have a lot of strep throat and stuff like that. But now that she doesn't have it, she just has consistent allergies and also got sick a couple times this semester. So the first thing I wanted to do is just, how am I going to be presenting these things is by presenting a general finding from my research and then going into kind of the evidence or discussion that I had with each person regarding this finding and where it came from. So I wanted to start out by talking about where we get the language that we use to communicate our sickness. And the kind of most concrete thing that I could find is that the language we use is generally socialized by our close kin groups. So I think Kat and Victor have the best example of this, because they both have two distinct phrases that they tend to use more than other people that they got from their family. So Kat, while I was talking to her, frequently used the term fuzzy throat to describe her symptoms. And at one point I asked her kind of to define this more and also where she got it. And she said that that she got this term from her family, and it generally means a scratchy or choppy throat, like feeling in your throat. But she felt like it was kind of different from just the normal, like if you said my throat is scratchy right now, it has a different connotation. I didn't like fully understand what that means. So I think that's another instance of, potential miscommunication. But she said that her kind of hypothesis for why she uses this term so much and why her family uses it so much is that if you're in a very close group with some people, for instance, your family, and you get the same illness as them, someone is going to say at some point, like, oh, I have a fuzzy throat. And since everyone is feeling the same thing at that time, they're able to identify with that term and use it in future settings. So it doesn't necessarily come from a specific definition of the word, but more of a label onto a specific sensation that is shared by a group of people. So I think this goes back to why, I didn't necessarily understand what fuzzy throat means, but if she says it to her family, if her family says it to her, they would all be able to identify this because they have felt a similar sensation before and have identified it with that label previously. So Victor also got a word from his family. He used the word blah a lot, and he identified this with his mom, because his mom also says the word blah a lot. So I asked him to define kind of what it means to him, and then also what it means to his mom. So he says that to him, blah is more of a description of a full body sickness. So as I said, Victor has bad seasonal allergies. So frequently his sickness is experienced as congestion. But in this case, it's more of an extension from that, in that he's now experiencing full body sickness, often with chills and fatigue, generally things in which he does not want to do a ton of movement, a ton of talking, just like lay there and rest. So his mom tends to actually use blah a bit differently. So this is somewhat a different experience than Kat talking about using the term fuzzy throat with her family. So when Victor's mom talks about feeling blah, it's generally in the context of her having a headache, and then just generally feeling ailed, not that great, and again, not wanting to do much. So even though they both use it in different contexts, Victor tends to be in more of a sick context versus his mom more in a headache context or achy context. They use it in similar ways, in that they're both kind of expressing a full experience of an ailment, and also not wanting to do a ton of things in that moment. For Agatha, she didn't really identify any specific sick language from her family. And Nikki also didn't get a specific term from her family, but says that she has a very specific way of talking about illness to her mom specifically, because they tend to share similar sensations. And more specifically, they both tend to get a lot of sinus pressure and tend to be very influenced by environmental changes, like a cold front or something, in terms of getting more or less sinus pressure. So she'll tend to use kind of specific language when talking to her mom about this, because they both know that one another experience it in a very similar way, saying and point out where they feel the sinus pressure, where they're experiencing drainage and things like that. So she says that she does not necessarily use the same language to discuss, to talk about this to other family members or other friends. So kind of keeping in with this conversation about close kin groups, now I'm going to move away from where we get the language that we use and more towards the communication patterns that we use to our close kin groups. So I generally divided this into two categories, or two communication patterns that I found that oftentimes when people are talking to close kin groups, they're either very, very descriptive, or they tend to use a shorthand. And I'll elaborate more as I discuss about each interviewee's experience with this. So in terms of the large amount of elaboration, most people identified this as talking to specifically their family about their sickness. So Kat says that whenever she feels sick, she will kind of just start sending a list of symptoms to her mom, and that this is both used for kind of a venting or an outlet, but also if her mom has any advice for medication or other things to do when she's sick. Victor did not necessarily identify with this experience of kind of sharing a lot to his parents, but Agatha definitely did. She, in general, does not tend to communicate a lot about her symptoms when she's sick to her peers, but she will call her parents and give them just a lot more description about how she's feeling. And then also similarly, Nikki is very descriptive about her symptoms when she's talking to her mom or to her girlfriend. So again, we see an instance where as one communication pattern where people will tend to be very descriptive about things about their illness when talking to someone they have a lot of trust with. On the other hand, I noticed that some people said they would tend to use more shorthand when talking to their friends and be less descriptive. So Kat says that since the friends that she has in college will tend to get sick around the same time because they'll get the same thing, that they'll use similar shorthand to kind of tell each other what they have. So you don't need to go into as much description about I feel this and this and this. They'll kind of identify one symptom or aspect that is the main thing of that sickness, and they'll use that to explain what they have. Victor also says that he tends not to he tends not to provide a lot of description when he's sick to his friends, because on one hand, he is already being sick around them and they've probably picked up on the fact that he's not feeling well, but also on the other hand, he doesn't really feel the need to provide proof of illness to his friends, because they will trust him not to misrepresent how he feels just to get out of something, which is a common fear that kind of got brought up through these discussions. So Agatha didn't really resonate with this as much. She said that most of her communication with her peers when she's sick is explanatory. So it's I'm not contagious, or I am contagious, and this is why I'm masking, this is why I'm coughing, stuff like that. And but then Nikki, similarly to Kat and Victor, also tends to use more shorthand when talking to her friends, of oh, I just feel under the weather, or I feel bad, I feel sick, because she feels like they are going to trust her and doesn't really need to say a lot more. So I kind of touched on this already of it's why are people talking so much about, oh, they will trust me even if I don't say that much? And this can be attributed to the fact that a lot of the people I talked to generally divided their symptoms into qualitative and quantitative, and saying that when talking to people who they have less of a trust bond with, they wanted to use more quantitative symptoms to provide proof that they're sick. So a good example of this is Kat, because she, as I said, she's gotten 3 fevers this semester. So typically when she gets sick, she'll just start checking her temperature. And then once she gets a fever, that can be the overall indication of her sickness. Because people have a general common understanding that if someone has a fever, they're probably just overall not feeling very well. So she can use that, the fact that she has a fever, as a very quantitative example of the fact that she's sick. So an example of this was that she was working with a classmate for a bit and was not feeling very well at all during the time, but didn't feel like she wanted to leave because she felt bad about, abandoning a classmate that she was working with if she didn't have enough proof of sickness. So, but then later that night, she actually did check and she had a fever. And so then she texted her classmate being I have a fever, I can't work tomorrow, and felt fine about that because that was enough proof of sickness. So again, this is an example of she's talking to someone who she has less of like mutual trust with. And in that case, she wants to provide more of a quantitative description of sickness. So Victor also identifies with this as he tends to, when communicating illness to work partners or professors, he wants to think of kind of the worst single symptom and then use that to describe the illness. So again, that'll tend to be something more quantitative of like, I have a really bad cough, or if he can use a specific like word of like a sinus infection or something like that, if he knows that he has that, he will say that to a work partner or a professor. Although a bit contrary to this, he tends to use more shorthand when he's talking to his research mentor, because his research mentor has a chronic illness and tends to be a lot more understanding of people not being able to do a lot if they are feeling unwell. So Victor will often just say, like, I've been sick recently, I haven't been able to do that, instead of trying to think of specific symptoms to provide proof of the sickness. Agatha has a bit of a different experience with this in that she didn't have a lot of opportunities to tell people about her sickness this semester, but there was one time that she wanted to explain to her professor that she probably could not give an upcoming presentation. And this was after she had a really bad cough, and therefore her voice was very, very hoarse. So as she was talking to her professor about this, her professor could clearly tell that Agatha had a hoarse voice and had been coughing a lot, and was therefore a lot more receptive to this request. So I think but that is another example of kind of the physical embodiment of sickness, this very quantitative, obvious thing contributing to the legitimacy of her request, rather than if Agatha had just been appearing perfectly fine and then had internally just been feeling a lot worse. So that's kind of the case for Nikki, in that she tends to feel a lot worse in her sickness during the times that she has more, like, less visible symptoms. So at the beginning of her sickness, she'll typically be very congested or have a big cough. But then after that, she'll just feel very, very fatigued and low energy. And that is when she'll feel her worst. So she finds the period in which she has this fatigue and low energy a lot more difficult to communicate, because she feels that just by saying, oh, I'm tired, is not necessarily as concrete as pointing to another symptom. So even during these times where the tiredness is the worst feeling, she will find some other symptom to point to, or some other example of a sickness to point to kind of communicate to her professors or to people that she has some sort of responsibility for. So then kind of the last thing I want to talk about is that in general, I found that misunderstandings can occur when the words that we're using do not encapsulate the scope or severity of the sensations that you may be experiencing. So this is also kind of related to what I was talking about right immediately before this, about Nikki's experiences with fatigue when she's feeling sick, and that it's a little more difficult to communicate that. But I'm going to extend this further to actually an anecdote that I heard about someone. So I was not able to contact her directly. Yes, I kind of ran out of time, but I still wanted to bring this up because I feel like it is a very good example of a lot of the things that I've been talking about. So this is in regards to Kat's sister, Stella. So Stella experienced a very bad case of COVID, and this was during college. And afterwards, was like frequently tired and would get a lot of headaches, just generally not feeling well, but had a really difficult time communicating this to her friends at college and also her family, because they didn't really understand how frequent this was for her and how severe it was. And they just felt like if she would say, I'm feeling tired right now, or my head hurts, that this is just the normal type of tired, the normal type of headache. And normal in quotes. But so she kept pushing herself through college, even though she was really not feeling well, until one of her friends got COVID, and then afterwards started feeling very similarly to Stella. And this caused them to both realize that they actually had long COVID. So although this was, unfortunate to realize, it did make Stella feel a lot more comfortable taking time off from college, because she felt like she kind of finally had one thing to identify as the reason that she was feeling so badly. So she took off time for college for her health, and, she's still taking time off right now. But I think this is a very poignant example of what I've been discussing, in that these symptoms of tiredness and headaches are some things that people might deem as more like qualitative symptoms, especially fatigue and tiredness, because it's something that you can experience in a lot of different ways. You can just experience it if you don't get a great amount of sleep or something. And because this notion of being tired or getting a headache generally is indicative of a single time that you're feeling like that, there's not a great way to say that, oh no, this is actually a very extended period of tiredness and an extended period of headaches. So these single words these words that we have may not necessarily encapsulate the scope and the severity of the symptoms. And so she was not really able to feel comfortable taking time off and feeling understood by people until she realized that she had long COVID, which is a more quantitative, like specific illness, or that you have. So those are my main findings. So obviously not every finding was fully supported by every interviewee. So I want to kind of make that clear, because these are subjective experiences and people can experience them in different ways. But I do think that these common themes did emerge through a lot of the discussions. So in terms of how we talk to our kin groups, I think people tend to use either a lot of description or unusual terms that they got from their families or kin groups, or they would use more shorthand to kind of quickly explain how they're feeling without providing a lot of proof. And then the notion of proof goes into how you talk to people outside of those kin groups, and that the division between qualitative and quantitative terms makes it so that you feel like you have to have more quantitative terms to prove your illness to people who you do not have as much mutual trust with. And I think this notion can be very problematic if someone is experiencing an illness that has symptoms that are not deemed quantitative. So we saw this a couple of times, most notably with Stella in her case of long COVID, but also with Nikki, and just the fact that often fatigue will impact her the most when she's sick. And also with me, I always feel like the fatigue and just the feeling of not wanting to do anything is kind of the worst part of being sick, personally, besides the more outward symptoms. So I wanted to relate this conversation to the anthropology of disability that we talked about in class. So I feel like, especially in terms of thinking about the division between the quantitative and the qualitative symptoms, I feel like this can definitely have some roots in ableist ways of thought, because the quantitative is something that you can kind of definitively point to as crossing being a able-bodied person and crossing into the state of unwellness. And having a cold and you're coughing and you have the flu and you have a fever, and these are these specific things that specifically an able-bodied person who's getting a cold might experience and say, this is the thing that I'm experiencing right now, and that is kind of the main state of unwellness that someone can experience. But in actuality, there's a far wider range of unwellness that might not just be encapsulated by the more quantitative symptoms. So I wish I had had kind of the opportunity to talk to people with chronic illnesses that have more qualitative symptoms, because I think this division would really impact those people. Because if you, for instance, have chronic fatigue, it may be very difficult to explain it, because fatigue and tiredness is seen as something that is not as much of a proof of your sickness, even if it's, impacting you very severely and very regularly. So Yeah, so I also kind of feel like this notion of needing a specific symptom to prove your illness reflects the notion of needing a diagnosis to be taken seriously by professors or by medical professionals or by peers or something like that. And that's something that we talked about during this unit in the anthropology of disability, in that oftentimes disabled people will kind of have to continue affirming their status as a disabled person to the people around them. And in order to do this, they usually always have to have a diagnosis. And those can also be very like difficult to get for different reasons. So I think that the quantitative symptom is kind of a offshoot of this notion of needing one specific thing to prove the fact and affirm the fact that you are in a certain state away from the able-bodied mentality of that's kind of propped up by society. And so I think this kind of the stuff that I've talked about is just another example of an instance in which the erasure of disabled bodies and their concerns has impacts on all aspects of society. So this even has impacts, on very mundane illness that like everyone will experience. So yeah, I just wanted to bring that up because I realized as I was conducting this research that the issues about communicating illness, it does affect me. It does affect like everyone who just has a cold or something, but it'll much more affect disabled people. So I wanted to reflect back on kind of how those impacts might occur. So I just wanted to wrap this up by going back to the paper at the beginning about the cultural system of health. So specifically highlighting this quote again about how each culture's classifications of symptoms, as well as their concepts of health and illness, are not universal and rarely reflect biomedical definitions. So I feel like the sentence is really helpful to like contextualize my findings. So at first we have this notion of a universal definition. And I think that goes back to the stuff that I talked about in terms of kind of the subjective terms that we use to communicate our illness. So for instance, something like blah, it really does not have a universal meaning or a biological definition, but it's still something that, people frequently use to communicate how they're feeling in a moment. And then also in terms of the notion of a cultural classification of symptoms, I think that really resonates with my finding about the division between the qualitative and the quantitative symptoms, and that this classification is very arbitrary, and that the categories are both representative of real experience of illness, yet they've been kind of culturally classified into these two categories in which the quantitative is seen as more valid than the qualitative as a sign of proof. And again, this is culturally impacted because it is impacted by our culture's notion of ableism. So those are the main findings that I got from my research. I really enjoyed getting a chance to talk to people and learn more about their experiences, and thinking about all of this within the context of cultural and social anthropology. So thank you so much for listening. Hope you learned something.